Okay, joining us now is Stephen Slate from Slate Digital to talk about some of the plugins that I'll be using in this mixing video. Stephen, welcome.
Hi, Adam.
So first, I want to talk about Trigger, which was, I believe, your first plugin that from Slate Digital. Now, back when I first heard about your company, you had just put your drum samples out. And they were amazing sounding, absolutely amazing. And I was saving up. I was going to get your drum samples, and I was going to get one of your competitors' drum replacement plugins. And then just weeks before I was going to do that, you announced Trigger, and everything about the competitors plugin that I was reading, bad things on different message boards, you fix, such as phase accurate triggering and just leakage suppression. So go ahead and tell us about Trigger and what you can do with it.
Well, as some people might know, I got my start in the industry doing drum samples. So after a lot of successful years making drum samples for a lot of other formats, I figured it only made sense to make my own format of drum software. So Trigger was our first in that line. And of course, I said, well, if we're going to do this, we need to fix the problems that I found in other drum plugins. So the first, like you said, was the phase accuracy, and then adding cool features and an easy to use interface and a great sample library. And it was pretty self-explanatory. It just kind of came together, and I got some really talented guys who knew how to code that thing properly, knew how to make a look ahead that could absolutely line the phase of the sample to the audio track, and it worked out great. It's a plugin that has surely been one of our most successful.
Yeah, that's, I think, one of the most amazing parts about Trigger is just how, it's so phase accurate, it feels like it's cheating,
It's very effortless to use. I mean, within minutes of using the plugin, you're up and running and your drum tracks are taken to whole new levels.
So I was looking more into the manual for Trigger, and there's, steps you need to take to really ensure that, your drum replacement is being replaced properly. So can you just detail me a little bit about that if you can?
Can you specify the question a bit more? I'm a little bit unclear what you're asking.
Okay. For example, if you record your drums, kind of quiet, there's certain things you need to do, or if like your original kick drum had a lot of bass in it, there's certain things you need to do.
Yeah, Trigger has a lot of features. For instance, if you have a too much bass, for instance, let's say in a snare or in a tom, you can put a filter in the detection circuit, which allows it not to mistrigger if it has the leakage of the kick drum. Of course, you can go further than that and use the leakage suppression, which will make sure that it's not triggering anything but the track that you want. Now, if you have a track that's too low in level, as an input slider, so you can control the level that's being fed into detection.
Okay, now something that I was wondering, when you use this plugin, do you compress your original drum track prior to putting Trigger on, or do you use
a lot of that depends on the original drum track, but usually not, because if you compress your original drum track, what you're actually going to be doing is bringing the track's leakage up in volume. You're compressing the dynamic range. Now, what you want for your triggered track is you want that dynamic range, and you want the detection to follow that dynamic range. Now, if you're, let's say, doing like a metal track and you want your output sample to not have too much dynamic range, there's controls on Trigger to do that. But for at least the detection, you're going to want to be as authentic as possible to the original playing. Of course, unless you really don't want to. I mean, if the player is extremely erratic, you might want to tweak a few things here and there.
Okay, we have Stephen back to talk about VCC, his Virtual Console Collection plugin, which I personally love. I thought it was snake oil, to be honest with you, at first, and then I tried it on a mix I had already done. And I know you're not really supposed to do it this way, but I use it like a summing box. And even though I don't even think I gain staged it properly back then. I didn't really know about gain staging too well, but it did something to the mix. The mix just sounded way better. It sounded like more professional. It sounded like it was coming out of the speakers. So, Steven, just explain kind of what's going on with this plugin.
Well, the Virtual Console Collection emulates analog consoles, and it does so by emulating the channel path via the VCC channel, and then also the center section summing via the mix bus plugin. And what we did is we found 5 really amazing sounding consoles. And by amazing sounding, I mean, again, consoles were built as a utility feature. You're supposed to put channels from the multi-track in them, and they're supposed to sum into stereo. However, of course, each console, being an analog circuit pad, has its own tone. And when signal goes through an analog circuit and amplifiers and summing and all these capacitors and transformers, it's going to add an inherent tone. And some of these consoles, like for instance a Neve 8048, its tone has kind of become thought of as a classic tone. So the VCC captures this in digital code and allows you to add this to your workstation. Now, your workstation, like Pro Tools or Cubase or Logic, that mixer has no tone. It's a simple math equation that mixes the channels and sums them into a stereo or sometimes a 5.1 or 7.1 mix, but it doesn't add any sonic additives. Now, an analog console does, and people tend to like some of the sounds of these additives, and the VCC just recreates that.
Yeah, it's the imperfections that make it perfect, is what I like to say, right?
Sure.
And that's what you're talking about. The nonlinearities is the imperfections.
Well, yeah, of course. I think a lot of these designers, when they were designing these consoles, they would have liked to have seen spec sheets that looked like a digital console with no distortion, no frequency or phase distortion, no harmonics, no harmonic distortion. That's what they wanted. But of course, it's very difficult to achieve that in the analog domain, especially back in, we're talking about like the 50s when the RCA tube console that we modeled was made.
Your other plugin that, I use on pretty much every track is the Virtual Tape Machines plugin. And, it works in a similar fashion, but it adds some extraness. So what's that extraness I'm talking about?
Well, tape machines work a little bit different than consoles. You're putting audio through magnetic tape heads onto a magnetic piece of tape, and it again, once it adds an inherent tonality. Again, people who manufacture tape machines were always trying to make it more and more transparent and less noisy, but a lot of these, non-transparent artifacts that tape adds, we tend to like, or a lot of people subjectively at least like the sound of. And the VTM captures 2 of my personal favorite tape machines that I've ever heard, which is a 1/2-inch mastering deck from Howie Weinberg Mastering, and then Jay Baumgartner of NRG Recordings 2-inch 16-track. And again, just running tracks on these machines or on through the emulations just adds stuff. It takes that layer of transparency away and adds stuff to it in a very dynamic and interesting way that I certainly like on my mixes, and apparently a lot of people have also enjoyed it.
Yeah, it's weird. It's hard to describe exactly, at least for me, what VCC and VTM does, but when you take the plugins off, or, when you bypass them,
right,
the mixes just sound like they fall apart and they just don't gel as well together. And that's really why, in this mixing video, I'm highly recommending people at least try, if not buy, your plugins.
Well, I hope people can give them a try and hope they enjoy them.